Hello, everybody. This is Andrew Colsky from StopMyOCD.com. And today we are here with Stephen Stark, who is going to share with us his story about how he dealt with OCD. And he's done some amazing things afterwards, which I'm going to hold as a surprise that we'll talk about later in the video. So, Stephen, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hey everybody, I'm Steve Stark, and I'm really thrilled to talk about my personal journey with anxiety, with OCD, and in particular, exposure therapy. I live in a small town about 30 miles east of Pittsburgh area, and did my undergraduate at Marymount Manhattan College in New York City. Have a degree in English, and I am a professional writer, primarily marketing content writer, and I have a strong interest in, personally and professionally, in healthcare and within mental health in particular. So one of the things that I do by trade is I help private practices and group practices connect with the right clients through marketing materials that might be blogs, ebooks, you name it. And yeah, I'm super thrilled to be here and to share my story, because hopefully it'll find at least somebody at the right time whenever they need to hear it.
Fantastic. And we're so glad to have you here. You know, it's interesting. We're doing this interview, and just before we're online now, I was doing one of the support groups. We offer a free support group through Stop My OCD. And,
Yes.
you know, some of the questions are, we have people who are coming in who are newly diagnosed with OCD, as an example, and they have a lot of questions. You know, what was it like for you? What was therapy like? I'm scared of the unknown of this exposure therapy that you talk about. And so, you know, these are the types of videos that are really helpful for people to be able to see and understand what a real person is going through. So why don't you start off by telling us, how did you first ever experience anything OCD?
So I don't know if it was OCD in particular per se, but it was definitely the beginnings of anxiety, and OCD was a big part of how that manifested. I think that I was probably always an anxious personality type, was just by nature from as young as I can remember, pretty introverted, a little bit anxious, just introspective, but not to an extreme, not to a point where it was, like a clinical issue. My first bout of what I felt was like overwhelming anxiety, where something felt really wrong, something felt even physically wrong, was, interestingly enough, in church. I was 12 years old, and I remember sitting in the pew, and I don't recall anything being particularly out of the ordinary that day, but I started to feel at first just very fidgety. And I remember my mother noticing that. And of course, as soon as she noticed that, that amplified the fear, which is, there's some classic, probably Freudian stuff going on there. But so, I saw the look of panic in her face, like something's wrong. So it just got more and more amplified to the point where I had to excuse myself, and like went into the restroom and just tried to calm down. And I was only 12 years old, but I really had the strong sense that, or the strong belief, really, and some of the symptoms that I was having like a heart attack. And so I remember I rushed out. I went into the church nursery there, and I said to the girl that was running, I said, I think I'm having a heart attack. And, it's just one of those things. It was one of life's mercies, where this girl, really just a couple of years older than me, was somebody that was very experienced in anxiety. And she knew it immediately just by looking at me that I was having an anxiety attack. And so she was able to explain that to me as best as she could, being only a couple of years older, and was able to calm me down, and that was great. But of course, the anxiety persisted. I kept having anxiety attacks, and the OCD symptoms started to really flare up. I became obsessed with hand washing. I was washing my hands like, I don't know, maybe 20 times a day, maybe more. And I was trying to keep that secretive because I felt like it wasn't normal. There was that part of my brain that knew that, I don't need to do this, but I also feel the need to do this. So I was keeping it secretive, and that, of course, made the anxiety build up even more. So, very strong compulsion for hand washing and arranging objects in such a way. It could be, oh, I don't know, just something sitting on a desk had to be at a certain angle for it to feel right, whatever that means. But just to get to that feeling of it feeling right. I remember getting up in the middle of the night. This is whenever VHS were still, the, the form of audio visual, entertainment. And so I remember getting up in the middle of the night, and my parents probably thought, "What the heck is going on?" But I would go through the drawers and have to arrange all the videotapes in such a way that just again felt right, like they all had to be in their cases. And um, I mean, it was a very strong compulsion. It was like I couldn't function, I couldn't get to sleep or go about my business once until I did that. And it seems kind of silly. It seemed kind of silly to me at the time, but at the same time, it wasn't silly at all. It was it was such an aggravation that it really felt like life stopped. And at that point, it kind of felt like life before anxiety and OCD started to flare up, and life after. It was a definite chapter marker in my life. And being so young, it was difficult to understand what was going on. It was very difficult to communicate what was going on. I just accepted this belief that I was going completely crazy, and I had to do everything that I could to try to hide it.
Wow, that's pretty tough for a 12-year-old, to have to feel that they have to hide things that are making them very uncomfortable. So
Yes.
at some point, I'm assuming you couldn't hide it anymore. How did your family react? How did it come about that you were willing to talk about it?
Okay, so we're looking at, let's see, um this was at a point in like the early to mid 90s, and we've come a long way in terms of not just tearing down stigma, but just literally understanding anxiety disorders. So, to my parents' credit, I don't think that they really understood what was going on, the severity of it. Um, and I think that, to be fair, I don't think that they really thought that somebody 12 years old could even really be going through such extreme torment. There were no obvious traumas that I'd gone through that I can really look to say, oh, that's, whenever this started. It did seem to kind of manifest alongside. I think there's probably something to it manifesting alongside puberty. But in any event, I didn't understand what was going on. They certainly didn't have the tools um, or the knowledge to really understand what was going on. I remember saying to my mother, like, something doesn't feel right. I feel completely different all of a sudden. And things just got a lot darker, just a lot more anxious. And so I do remember articulating that, but didn't quite have the words or the understanding or the context to really make much sense of it. So I did go several years, um, just trying to keep this all inside, and just deepening the real belief that I'd really gone completely insane. I mean, that was the word that I would use to describe myself, like I'd gone completely crazy. So it became much more difficult to relate to my peers. I probably became more introverted. It just became much more difficult to relate to the world around me because of what was going on in my inner world. And like I said, a lot of the times the obsessions or the compulsions or the things that make you anxious do seem kind of silly. I mean, they don't necessarily seem silly at the time, but sometimes they are. Sometimes whenever you try to articulate them, they sound really silly. But I think one of the most important things to keep in mind here is that it's not so much the content of your OCD, of your obsession or your compulsion or whatever makes you anxious. It's not so much about the content of it, whatever it is. It's all about the mechanics of it, how it hijacks your brain and how it makes the smallest thing, silly, seemingly silly things, seem like an absolute emergency in
Right.
your brain.
Right. But
So, yeah.
well, I'm curious before you go too far past it. So you described that one of the things that you were doing was washing your hands a lot.
Yes.
So you're in this situation where you don't know what's going on. Your parents don't know what's going on. I'm assuming they probably saw you washing your hands a lot. Did they ever
Right.
try to stop you from washing your hands, or how did they react?
Yeah, there wasn't an extreme reaction, but I do remember them saying, like it's probably not necessary that you do that. And of course, I didn't need to be told. I knew that it wasn't necessary. That's why I was trying to hide it. But part of my brain also felt like it was absolutely necessary that I was averting, deathly illness or something,
Mhm.
unless I did it. So that's one of the hardest things about OCD. I feel like people with OCD probably understand cognitive dissonance better than anybody because you hold two beliefs to be absolutely true at the same time all the time, especially whenever you're really in the thick of it, because you know that the compulsions are ultimately not necessary. They're not necessary to your survival, but they also feel that way at the same time. So it's like two, I'm not a clinician, but it feels like it's probably two different parts of the brain competing with different ideas or different emotions. So you very quickly realize with OCD that your brain is many brains. It's many different parts. And sometimes, I guess that's why they call it disorder, because they're not always on the same page. So there's a bit of conflict there of like, on one hand saying this is absolutely absurd what I'm doing. This is absolutely ridiculous. But then the other part of you is like, I know I'm not going to get that temporary, even if it's just a couple of seconds relief, unless I do this small ritual, unless I do this thing.
Right, right. Wow. So you're struggling with this for years. You're
Yeah.
not clear on what's happening. You're feeling, different, and you don't know why. So
hmm
what happens that you eventually learn what's going on?
Okay. So before I get into that, I'll just say that the nature of my OCD, like the content of it is what I'll call it, um, kind of evolved a little bit. And I kind of got away from like the hand washing stuff. I was still pretty concerned about like arrangement of objects. But and this is a little difficult to explain, but bear with me.
Mhm.
Um, so I had an obsession with um, this really a thought, the possibility that somebody was going to um, get hurt, and particularly with their hands. So I would become obsessed on somebody's hands as they were speaking to me. And like, let's say they were shuffling a stack of papers. I would become mortified they were going to like cut their, get a paper cut.
Mhm.
Just one example. I mean, they could have their, like, I remember being in shop and we're working with metal and I thought somebody was going to like harm themselves, not on purpose, but like, cut themselves on the metal or something.
Right, right.
Or like handling wood and you're going to get a splinter. So for whatever reason, I just became absolutely obsessed with this. So I would focus in on people's hands and I would be very concerned that other people were going to get hurt. And of course, they never did. But in my mind, I would kind of go there and play out the whole scenario. And I'd be envisioning people with these horrific cuts and I would internalize the pain. And I would kind of get that cringe feeling that you have whenever you watch a horror movie and somebody gets hurt and you kind of feel it. I would have that all the time.
Mm.
And I didn't even actually have to see somebody getting hurt. It was just the imagined possibility that they would get hurt, and I would internalize it. And that just got really out of hand because my compulsion was to look away, right? To not look at their hands or try to not look at people. And that becomes problematic. And like most compulsions, it doesn't ultimately satisfy the feelings of anxiety. So anyway, that's what it had evolved into. And it got really extreme. And I remember being in school. I was in class one day, and it just got to the point where I couldn't focus on my schoolwork. I couldn't pretend like I was okay anymore. I just got up and I didn't excuse myself. I just walked to the guidance counselor's office and I said, something is wrong. I need help.
Wow.
So fortunately, they did get me help, started on the traditional therapy slash, psychiatric drug regimen, and definitely did get relief from that. And kind of stayed with that for a good while until I was about 29 years old,
Mm.
around there. So like things, got better. There were definite ups and downs, but the piece that was missing was exposure therapy. So whenever I was about 29, 30, I found by luck um, a highly skilled psychologist that specializes in anxiety disorders and exposure therapy, and explained how it worked, why it's so effective. I'm the type of person, I'm skeptical, so I wanted to hear about the research on how and why it's so effective. And anyway, this psychologist, guided me through exposures that we actually did in session and exposures that I would do on my own at home. Use the worksheets, use the guides, did it very systematically, did it the right way.
Mhm.
And so whenever I did that, that was my ticket out of hell.
Right, right. So, I know one of the questions that I get asked a lot is people who are first diagnosed with OCD
Mhm.
and they hear about exposure therapy and they don't know what it really means. And there's a lot of fear. It's like, oh my gosh, is this going to be painful? Is this going to be
Mhm.
hard? Can you give just a brief explanation of what your experience was? What were your concerns before you did it? How did it go when you started doing it? And help someone understand it.
Okay, so one of the things that you realize is that your first experience, whenever you actually start doing it, is that your anxiety in relation to your OCD or whatever other anxiety disorder you're trying to conquer, uh, your anxiety is going to go off the charts because you're going to do the very thing that you've been avoiding for years or decades, and that is like fully head on facing your fear or anxiety or whatever it might be. So that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, that your therapy is going to start in some form of essentially suffering.
Mhm.
But um, it actually didn't strike me as that unusual because I think deep down inside, I just intuitively knew that that was the way. I think we kind of know that deep down, that facing things head on, that's what's going to do the trick. But what I didn't have was the clinical part, the part that my psychologist walked me through, which is the systematic way of doing this. So whenever it was presented to me that way, it's not like we're just going to go in and I'm going to face all my fears. It's like, no, we're going to do this in increments. We're going to do it in an organized way. It's going to be at a certain time every day. It's going to be rough, but you know, there's a system
Mhm.
at play here, and you have to follow that, and you have to obviously want to do it because it's no easy task to face your fears head on or what makes you anxious. it does to a large extent feel, it feels very strange. It seems counterintuitive. It seems counterproductive, but it works. And whenever you want to understand, why it works, it really does. It makes complete sense.
Mhm. So, you described that when you were first facing your fears, that it was really, high up on the anxiety charts.
Yeah.
For you personally, how long did that high anxiety last? Was it long term? Was it short term? What happened?
Okay. So at first it seemed it felt crippling. Um, at very first, just because you're completely changing course. It's like been running away, running away, running away, trying to hide, and then just trying to change course at first. It's a rocky start. And I think that a lot of people probably have that experience because it's such dramatic change in not only behavior, but just the way that you're approaching things, the way that you're approaching your journey to wellness.
Mhm.
So at first, it definitely spiked. And I also noticed at first it was kind of up and down. It wasn't like, okay, peak and then just, smoothly downhill. It was kind of all over the place, all over the place. Some days it was like, wow, I feel like I have this. I was maybe like 2 weeks in and I was like, I think I got this. And the next exposure would be off the charts. And I was like, man, I feel like I'm back to where I started from. So the beginning is very, rocky.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that people have to stick with it. For me, it was definitely worth sticking with it because eventually it did. I would take a look at my worksheet and I would realize, oh wow, only in the span of, just like a couple of weeks, my anxiety overall, whenever I do these exposures, has gone down. I'm actually experiencing less anxiety whenever I'm facing head on the things that make me feel the most out of control and uncomfortable.
Mhm.
So I realized relatively quickly, the return on investment, it, it happened pretty quickly.
Right, right. So today, as you're sitting here with me, how would you describe the impact of OCD on your life today?
Well, it's still with me. I think that my gut feeling is that it will always be with me, but it's not hell anymore and it's not a total trap anymore. And it's something that occasionally during periods of usually heightened anxiety, usually external situations, that it, kind of flares up. I call it an OCD flare up. But at least now I know that, even if it starts to creep back in, I got my ticket out of hell. I have the technique, the exposure therapy technique. It's always with me. And, sometimes I still do work, with my therapist to number one, help me identify that, oh, wait, this is OCD. This is anxiety. Sometimes that's the hardest part is just realizing, oh, okay, what I'm experiencing is OCD. Okay. Now that I've recognized that, I know what to do. I know what to do. And so yeah, still with the help of a therapist, I return to the technique and I do my exposures. I do notice that now that I'm kind of I don't want to say seasoned pro, but I am experienced in doing it. I'm able to nip it in the bud much quicker. It works much faster now.
Right, right. Great, great. I'm glad to hear that. So,
Yes.
you've been through a long journey. You've had some of the most, you know, common things that we think of when we think of OCD, the hand washing and the arranging and those things.
Right.
And you've gone through exposure therapy, you've had medications, you've made
Mhm.
tremendous progress,
Mhm.
and you have a personal interest in mental health.
Yeah.
So I know you and I were talking before we started the podcast. What have you done about that? Share with us your story today.
Yeah. So, like I said, I am a writer by profession, with a strong interest, in mental health. And so I've always had this desire to try to give back because, there's been my psychologist, there's been other people, non-clinical people in my life that have been supportive and have just really, family, friends that have really been there. And so since I feel like I've made progress in my own journey through OCD, and by the way, I try to catch me if I say it. One of the things that I try for me to never say is my OCD or my anxiety. It's like just anxiety, OCD, and journey through. And I understand why people say my OCD because it's very personal. It's a very personal journey, but I try to put space between me and it. I try to not identify with it as much anymore. But anyway, I understand why other people say that. For me, it's very important. I try to catch myself whenever I say my anxiety, my OCD. Anyway, I've always had this desire to give back. Just to give back is, I don't know, just an altruistic desire to share what has worked for me, what has helped me. So I'm not a clinician, so I can't really, I can't with any authority, take somebody through their personal journey through exposure therapy, and I'm not exactly qualified to go through the absolute ins and outs of exactly what exposure therapy is and how it works. But what I can do is I can offer very practical, real tips that helped me through my journey with exposure therapy. These are just little things that made exposure therapy a little bit easier, and made it more effective for me. So I wrote a very brief and concise book, that I've self-published and put up on Amazon. And I'll show you the cover. Unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy yet. It's not available as a hard copy yet being the key word, but it's done pretty well on the Amazon charts. And this is the book that I wrote. This is a printout from my antiquated printer, but yeah, that's the cover.
Pretty good. Now we can
And
see. So it's the Exposure Therapy Companion?
Yes, this is the Exposure Therapy Companion. And it's just full of quick, very practical tips for confronting and conquering your fears as you're doing exposure therapy. And this book is meant to be used while you're in a clinical scenario, situation where you're, doing exposure therapy already with a clinician. And these are things to help you get the most out of it, to lessen some of the anxiety around doing the therapy and some of the discomfort, and to stick with it, because sticking with it is, that's one of the most important things whenever you're doing exposure therapy is sticking with it and the regularity of it, so you can lay down those new neural pathways, and just really hardwire this stuff, because you're going to do a lot of hard work, so you might as well make it stick, make it last. And part of that is the regularity, doing it on a regular basis. And I would say, it all depends on what your clinician says, of course, but I think that most clinicians would probably want you to do exposures outside of that 1 hour a week or whatever it is too. Yeah. So yeah, this book is just full of, things, nothing that's too complicated, things that pretty much everybody can do. And it's everything from using sticky notes to remind yourself about, doing certain exposure therapies or not avoiding certain things, to switching up the setting in which you do your exposures, so you don't just condition yourself to only confront your fears in one particular chair in one particular room, or even at one particular time during the day, kind of switching it up. And yeah, so it's just full of little tips like that, so you can get the most out of this, because like I said, it's a lot of work, you go through a lot, you expend a lot of energy, so you need every single weapon in your arsenal, that you possibly can have, because it takes a lot of you, and it's a very brave thing to do. So I wanted to give people just some small things that aren't too life-changing, don't require, it doesn't require much stuff, like doesn't require anything that you need to buy. It doesn't demand of you to reorganize your schedule, but they're just little adjustments that you can do to make to make this experience better and to make it ultimately more effective.
Mhm. Wow, that's great. I'm what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to how people can get to that book at the bottom of the video here. So if you're watching this video and you're interested in the book, and perhaps you're doing exposure therapy already with your therapist, sounds like a great resource to draw from. So we'll have access to it under the video here, and you can get your own copy. Um, so this has been really great information, and I'm so glad that you and my other guests are willing to share their stories, because it's when you're on your own and you don't know what's going on, it's really scary. And when you can hear that there's other people that are having the same experiences, and I'm not alone, I'm not the only one, it makes it so much more palatable, and reduces the stigma and the shame, and allows people to reach out for help. So tell us, if you had some parting thoughts for someone who's watching this video and is struggling themselves, what would be the most important things that you would want them to know?
Well, I'd want them to know that you can do it. I came from an absolute cannot do mindset whenever I entered into therapy, right before I started exposure therapy. Um, I would just say to anyone out there that feels stuck and like they're like they are condemned to this personal hell that is OCD or other anxiety disorders, you can do something about it. It might get scarier at first. It's kind of the nature of things, but it does work. There is a way out. And I would just caution people against kind of trying to take on, especially exposure therapy, completely on their own. Like I said, I can't emphasize enough that this is a systematic approach, and having a professional that has done this with other people and understands all of the nuances and the setbacks that a patient can go through, that's really important. It's really important to do it the right way. Anybody can, it's easy to say, I'm just going to go out and confront all my fears, but that's not exposure therapy. The therapeutic element means that it's very systematic. But the ultimate message is one of hope. I was at a point once where I was essentially agoraphobic. And as I mentioned earlier, I had a problem with even looking at people's hands. That was part of my OCD thing. Through a lot of the work that I did, I moved to New York City. I did my undergraduate degree there. I never thought that would have been possible. I never thought that I would get to the point where I would have the clarity and the knowledge and the wisdom to write a book to help other people get through similar things. It just seemed like an absolute impossibility. So it's amazing what you can overcome. And like I said, I haven't completely, slayed the dragon that is OCD, but it's become more of like a domesticated pet than a terrifying, monster.
Right. I like that. And that's an important point, is that, OCD is not one of those things that you take a pill and it's cured. OCD is something that you learn to manage. And
Yes.
if you do it effectively through therapy and all the things that Steve is talking about here, then it becomes less of your life. It's always going to be somewhere in the background, but it's not going to have anywhere near the impact that it does in the beginning.
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of noise that OCD creates for me now is just it's so minimal. I've been able to really kind of tune it out and tune it down. And also just, every time that I do have a OCD flare up and I get over it and I use my, the tools that I've acquired, It really does get less and less threatening every time because your brain learns, okay, this isn't life threatening. This isn't such an emergency. I will get over this, and that becomes a little more ingrained, deeper, deeper, deeper each time.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your message. I'm excited about the fact that you've written this book. It sounds like such a great resource for people. Like I said, the link to finding the book will be at the bottom of this video, and I encourage people to take a look at it. And
Awesome.
maybe there's some additional books in you that will be coming out in the future. I don't know. We'll keep our eyes open.
I think that there are. I think that there are. I think this has kind of awakened something in me, and just the little bit of feedback. Like it hasn't been out there for very long. It hasn't even been out there for really even 2 months yet. But the feedback that I've received is really positive, and it makes me feel good that I could help even just one person. And yeah, thank you for setting up this platform. I've really enjoyed looking at the other interviews that you've done with individuals. I think that this is extremely important work, and I feel really honored to have been interviewed on your podcast today. So thank you.
Well, we're glad to have you. So,
Cool.
all right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.